Let me
Looks live. It's got a counter on it.
check
That
it
looks
here. Yep, it says live. And says live. Okay, it looks like we're live. Okay, we're here with Adam today. And Adam and I have interacted a little bit on social media. And he is here to talk about physics from the Holy Land. So, Adam, why don't you give us a little background on yourself and how you ended up in the Holy Land doing science?
Sure. Yeah, so I grew up an American, as you can tell by my accent. I grew up in the Midwest in Iowa in a very conservative and religious family, and then kind of bounced around in college for quite a few years, and ended up with an undergrad degree in physics because I had enjoyed physics books when I was a kid. Got a graduate degree, a master's in nuclear engineering, and then worked as an engineer for about 8 years. And then had an unexpected job loss a few years ago. And my wife and I had both lived overseas before. She was raised Jewish. I have long been in sort of the Jewish community, and we decided to move overseas after that job loss. We just moved before that, so we were in a new place, didn't have any real connections, and don't have kids. So we decided to move to Israel, and after deciding that, just came here and tried to figure out what I wanted to do. And there's several big universities here, and I ended up really enjoying the guy who's now my advisor. So I'm getting a PhD. The degree is technically in nuclear engineering, but the work that I do is experimental physics. So I don't have my PhD yet. I'm not a doctor. I do physics on a daily basis, and I get paid to do it. So you could call me a professional physicist, but I'm at the low rung of that ladder.
And looking around, you are at BGU, is that right?
That's correct. So this is Ben Gurion University of the Negev. Israel has, I don't know, half a dozen universities. This is probably the closest to like a big state school in America. We have a big campus. There's dorms reasonably close to the university. There's not a whole lot else in this city. We're down in the south, just north of the big Negev desert. So it's real hot and dry here. We get big dust storms in the spring. But yeah, this is a big university. And like I said, I'm in the nuclear engineering group.
Yeah, looking around, it's a research university. What exactly is a research university?
Well, I think that again, it's sort of equivalent to like a big state university. So we have every undergraduate degrees, master's degrees, and doctoral degrees. The school system does work a little bit differently here in Israel, but especially once you get up to the university level, they're pretty comparable across different countries. So people who are pursuing advanced degrees like masters and PhDs, those dissertations are made public, and the work is provided. The work is paid for usually by funding through grants and things like this. So the professors apply for grants, and then when they receive them, they put students to work doing research and publish papers. So that's basically what it means.
Okay, and you said you are involved in a research in ultra rare decays. So
That's true.
for us people that are not physicists, what does that mean?
All right, so we are looking for something that almost never happens. We're looking for this, what's called neutrinoless double beta decay in xenon. So xenon is a rare, heavy, noble gas. It does not really interact with anything. It's basically inert, so it doesn't do anything. And we have a big tank of it under the Spanish Pyrenees, sitting under a mountain to shield it from cosmic rays. And it's in this big tank with an electric field across it, and every once in a while, one of those atoms will decay, and when it does, it makes a little flash of light. And we look for those flashes and determine characteristics of xenon based on that. So we haven't seen the neutrinoless kind yet. We're hoping for it, but there's a lot of other groups looking for it too, and it's kind of a race. This is one of the big subjects in experimental physics these days.
And I've got to ask, since you are in Israel, Um, I would guess that you work with a lot of believers that do physics.
I do, in fact, yeah. So Israel's kind of a weird country in the religious landscape, I guess, world. So I grew up in America, but I've lived also in France and Belgium, so in Europe, and I lived in Haiti for a while. So I've gotten around, I've traveled extensively. So I've seen a lot of different communities and how they behave. In Western Europe, it really is quite secular. People attending religious services of any kind is very rare. You still do get some of that. You know, most of Western Europe is sort of nominally Catholic, and you see a bunch of that. Israel is strange because it has, you know, religion as part of its founding narrative and raison d'etre. So to be a protective state for the Jewish people is sort of the main idea behind the state of Israel. And so we welcome Jews from all over the world. But that being said, the criteria for immigrating to Israel is basically you have to have one Jewish grandparent, and that's it. Which that's the criteria that Hitler used to decide if you were Jewish enough to be gassed to death, and that's what the state of Israel uses to decide whether or not you can come here as a Jew. So other non-Jews do come to Israel too, but not as many. That's difficult. So there are many people who are Jewish by this determination who are not seen as Jewish by the religious community. And as a result, it ends up that it's actually a very secular country. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had a very large influx of Russian Jews, and most of these people were not observant, really in any sense, because of the history of the Soviet Union. So we have a very, very large secular community here. And at the same time, because it's Israel, and because this is the heart of, you know, some of the world's major religions, there's also a great deal of religion. I would say it's kind of like America in terms of diversity, but we're all squished together. So in America, you have the religiosity of the rural South, and you have the irreligiosity of sort of, you know, you can imagine urban San Francisco. But whereas in the United States, these are separated by 800 miles. Here in Israel, they're right next door. So this causes some tension.
I bet it's interesting.
Yeah.
Now, you've talked before with creationists and flat earthers, and why do you think that they have such a persistence in their arguments? Do you think that it's religious based, or are they just out to, you know, set themselves up as smarter than all the
Yeah.
physicists?
So you're right. Uh, yeah. So I've spent probably a good chunk of the last decade talking very intently with creationists and young Earth creationists and flat earthers. Partly because my family is mostly creationist, or at least in large measure. So this was what sparked my curiosity. Now, when you say, is this motivated by religion, that really depends on what you mean by religion, and people will define religion in incredibly varied ways. So you know, I don't know, maybe I think that the impulse that drives these communities is the same as the impulse that drives a lot of religion, but I wouldn't say necessarily that their views are driven by religion. I think that there is a natural human tendency to want to be smart. This is, you know, what drives our curiosity and scientific development, and that's a great thing. But it's the driver is for the feeling, and the feeling doesn't necessarily have to correspond with reality. People don't really care if they are smart; they care if they feel smart. And so you can feel smart in lots of different ways. You can feel smart just by people telling you you're smart. And so you can feel smart by thinking that you know better than the people who are seen as smart by society. And I do think that that drives a lot of it. I know in my sort of family and this background, I knew a lot of people who really were very proud that they believed differently than the mainstream. You go look on Fox News, and the most watched news station in America for years now, and they have tons of viewers, tons and tons and tons of people watch Fox News, and the hosts on these shows will talk about the mainstream media. Fox's news is as mainstream as it gets. I mean, this is big media. Like,
Right.
It's absurd, but it's this desire to know better than the experts, which unfortunately we've seen the last few years of COVID that this can lead to real problems.
And being told what you want to hear is part of the problem too.
Yeah, yeah, it is. Although I think that that's less of a thing than it's sometimes made out to be, because I think people don't always know what it is that they want to hear. Steve Jobs famously said that sometimes people don't know what they want to buy until you show it to them. Like, I think that's true of information too. If you, so I studied some anthropology early in my university program, and they talk a lot about thought leaders and community leaders and stuff. And not always the most popular way to frame things, but I think that there's some truth to it, that there are leaders of these communities, Tucker Carlson or whoever, and they have a big microphone, Donald Trump. They can get up there and they can start saying a narrative and get a lot of traction with people who really haven't made up their mind. I mean, when COVID came along, it was a novel disease. Nobody had seen this before. There was no pre-existing narrative. And that narrative was shaped over the course of 2 years, and it was not shaped by all of these individuals wanting to hear the same thing. They heard the same thing from the people that they already trusted for other information, and that forged their views. For example, here in Israel, there also was anti-vaccine, kind of anti-mask stuff. That was a community here, but it happened to be on the political left rather than the political right. And part of that, I think, is just because the way that the leaders shaped the things in Israel at the time. The political right was in control under Netanyahu, and the political left didn't like him. And so when Netanyahu said, you should wear masks and get a vaccine, the people on the left said, we don't like him. We don't want to do what he says. Well, in America, Trump was very skeptical and had some of those pre-existing views, talked about vaccines giving you autism, this complete nonsense. And so I think he was already sort of predisposed to some of that, and he helped drive that narrative among the American politics.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
So I was looking around, and interestingly, that everybody knows that Israel has nukes, but I assume that they had nuclear power too. But it doesn't seem like Israel has nuclear power. Why is that?
It is correct that we do not have nuclear power. At least it is correct that Israel does not have any nuclear power plant that is connected to the electricity grid. That is a true statement.
Is there a reason behind it, or?
I mean, so first of all, total disclaimer here, my technical expertise, I'm going to more or less separate here. Anything related to weapons and stuff, I'm just going to bow out and say no comment on that.
Yeah, I understand the weapons thing. I was just
no,
curious
regarding
why they don't have any plants, right?
Sure. So no, that I can talk about. So my master's degree was in power engineering. So this is like power plant technology and whatnot. And then I worked in sort of nuclear fuels to some extent for several years. So there's a couple reasons. One is that most modern design nuclear power plants provide a lot of electricity, that more electricity than you would need for a country the size of Israel. So Israel is roughly the size of the state of New Jersey. That's about how big we are. And our power grid, our whole power grid, the whole country, is probably less than you would get out of a decent sized nuclear power plant. Okay. And power, like any other resource or your energy portfolio, like a stock portfolio, is good to have diversity. You really don't want your whole country powered by one plant, because what happens when that plant goes down or becomes a target or something, then your whole country is out of power. Like that, it's just not a good idea. So then, okay, well, you could build one and sell whatever excess to the neighbors. Well, unfortunately, our neighbors are not real interested in buying things from us. So there's not really a market to sell any excess. So it just doesn't really make sense economically or technically for Israel. Which I don't know, is too bad. I think nuclear power is a great technology, and I'd like to see more of it. But yeah, it doesn't really make sense here.
You are about 8% solar over there, and they have a goal for 20% coming up in a few years.
We have a lot of solar.
Do you see a lot of that going up then?
We do, yeah, yeah. I see quite a bit. There's a lot here in the south. Like I said, this is a desert area, so there's a lot of open land that's not particularly suitable for agriculture, and you do see quite a few solar plants. We have several different kinds as well. There's a pretty innovative solar thermal plant that's reasonably close to where I live. All these mirrors focus the light onto a hot water tank. Up at the top. It's kind of cool. Although the neighbors, the people who live in that area, all complain because the thing is literally brighter than the sun. You know, like you can't look at it, so it blocks off a whole area. It's anyway. Yeah, and then Israel also has a ton of rooftop solar water heaters. So the most, at least in my experience in the U.S., most houses have a water heater that's just sort of on all the time, or these little pilot light, and then it heats up or whatever you said, a temperature. Here, almost every house, and pretty much everyone I've ever been in, there's a panel up on the roof that has pipes that heat the water. And then if that's not enough hot water for you, which it often is, surprisingly, if that's not enough, then there's a little switch you can turn on electric heater and the water heater too. But, yeah, so we have a lot.
And let's see. So in the area you're in, then is it pretty quiet then usually then, or I see, you know, everybody hears things on the news. I mean, is it relatively?
We had ISIS attack here a week and a half ago, something like that. Probably I have the place where I bought this T-shirt, I think, actually. So yeah, it's unfortunately the nature of Israel is not as much quiet as you might like. It comes with the territory, literally. My wife and I moved here 3 years ago. It's not like this is a new thing. We came here knowing this. It's a sad state of affairs. Really, it sucks. I think that the Arab-Israeli community has been really good in the last few years, especially at finally getting their act together to exercise political power. And there's an Arab member of Knesset, and I'm hopeful that will continue because that community needs good political representation. But yeah, it's not always quiet now.
Yeah, I had seen your post about it. That's why I was curious. So
yeah. Well, unfortunately, it tends to come in waves, and then in the last 2 weeks we've had 4 separate attacks: 2 in Tel Aviv, 1 here, and 1 in Jerusalem. So everybody's kind of crossing their fingers, hoping that there won't be a whole lot more. But it's next week or this week, I guess, is Passover, and then it's already the month of Ramadan, and then Easter is coming up too. So whenever you have this sort of, you know, the stars aligned, you get more tension.
On the James Webb, I seen you had a post about the James Webb.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Are you geeked about what they might see peering back billions of years?
Yeah, I love it. I am not an astronomer. I deal with very small stuff, not very big stuff. But I think astronomy is fascinating. I love the power of astronomy to bring people into physics as a field. When I was a kid, it was always the space adventures, you know, Star Trek and stuff, and the pictures of from the Mars rovers and all this that really got me interested in physics. And why I ultimately ended up with a degree in physics. And I think it's absolutely wonderful that we have this incredible piece of technology that is going to help answer some really interesting questions. And I remember when I was in high school, my high school teacher was lamenting, my physics teacher was lamenting how, you know, back in Benjamin Franklin's day, people did science in their basement. And why doesn't anybody do science in their basement anymore? I get the mentality, but science has changed a lot. And, people can't build a particle collider in their basement or, you know, do something like the James Webb. And there's great public outreach, which is fantastic. And there's some great like public collaborative stuff. I don't know if there's going to be anything like that with James Webb. The way that telescopes are usually run is that astronomers will petition, they apply for time. So they make a
Right.
request. I'd like to use the telescope during these hours, and this is what I want to look at. And then there's a review committee that reviews and decides schedules who gets to use it when. So I don't know if there's going to be anything public coming out of it, but I'm sure there'll be tons of pictures, and they're going to be fabulous. So yeah, it's really exciting.
Now on to the let's play a little conspiracy stuff. I get a lot of these questions. I'm sure you've heard them too. Being in the Holy Land, are religious people fired for doing science?
For doing science? No, nor are they fired for being religious. You asked earlier if I had a lot of religious people that I work with, and I have a colleague in my workspace. I won't say too much, but who is a young Earth creationist, who is a physicist, and they do exist. They maintain jobs. It's not a secret. It's something they can talk about, and nobody cares. That's fine. People aren't fired for doing science either. This is just not the way it works, at least not in a big institution. I'm sure that there are small private schools, wherever here or in the States or wherever, where things aren't as well maintained. But in a big public institution like a public university, they have human resources departments, and they have legal counsel and all this kind of stuff. And there's legal requirements about what you can do with people who are employees and what justification you have to have for firing them and stuff. So yeah, Israel's a modern first world democracy with a strong legal system. So yeah, no, people aren't fired for silly stuff like that.
One of the arguments you'll hear is that you all have the same evidence, but you come to different conclusions. So in your experience, if you're a believer, a non-believer, if you're a young Earth creationist, are they coming to different conclusions in their research, or are they actually coming to similar conclusions in their research?
Well, no, I think that that's true. We do have the same evidence, and we come to different conclusions. Okay, that's fine, fair enough. If I have 2 apples and I add 2 more apples, and we count the total, and I say there are 4 apples, and you say there are 5 apples, and we're both looking at the same grouping, we have the same evidence, and we've come to different conclusions. It happens to be that your conclusion is objectively wrong. Okay.
Right.
But yes, that is it's a true accurate description to say that we have the same evidence and come to different conclusions. A flat earther can watch a sunset or watch the moon go past the horizon, just like me, and they evaluate from that evidence that the earth is flat. But I know at least high school level trigonometry, and I can show you that the fact that it goes past the horizon therefore means the earth is not flat. That is a very simple observation that demonstrably proves that the earth is not flat. And we can both stand side by side and watch the same event. We have the same evidence, and they come to a different conclusion. It's just that theirs is objectively wrong. Okay.
I was watching Professor Dave the other day, and he was very frustrated doing a flat earther. I don't even call it a debate. It's just kind of a back and forth. But yeah, it's just frustrating because the things they're saying, like you said, it's high school things can defeat their arguments. And
sure. Well, yeah. I mean, whether or not you get frustrated, I think depends a lot on what your objective is and what your expectations are. When I very first, got into this sort of anti-science communities, these creationist communities, and then flat earthers, this was a decade ago. Again, I come from an extremely religious family. It was creationist, and I did not. I perhaps went into it expecting that I could change the minds, and I was studying physics in college at the time, and so I thought, well, man, I've done this stuff in my homework. I can prove that this is true, and I know that this person doesn't believe it. I can explain to them what I learned in class, and we can talk about it, and I can show them why they're wrong. And I learned pretty quickly that no, you can't. You cannot show them that they're wrong. They are not interested in that, and that's fine. A lot of people get very frustrated at that, and it causes a lot of arguments. I feel like I took eventually, at least, I took a different path, and I decided, my conversations aren't to convince somebody. That's not what I'm doing. When you see me debate on Facebook, or get into some long conversation, I have almost no expectation whatsoever that I'm going to convince anybody of anything, at least not the person I'm talking to. And
Right.
frankly, the person I'm talking to is not my audience. I don't really care what they think. I know at the end of the day, they're going to continue believing exactly the same thing that they believed before. The person I do care about is the one who happens to be reading these comments and isn't saying anything at all. And
Mhm.
you might be surprised at just how many people there are who are doing that. And I have had many of them message me privately and say, hey, I really appreciated what you said here. Or people who tell me, look, I lurk on your page, and I read all your comments. And so, like, those are the people I'm writing for. I'm not writing for the people who I'm ostensibly arguing with. You
Right.
can't expect to change them.
I've got a similar thing. I've got followers that are in religious areas, religious families, but yeah, they send me a message and, hey, yeah, I can't really say I liked your post or anything, but I liked your post,
Yeah.
and for me, it's really hard to believe, that in the 21st century, there are people that are still, got to hide out
Oh,
because they
yeah.
didn't,
I mean, I don't find that difficult at all. But that's because my background is very much like that.
and you would think it
Yeah.
would be more in the Holy Land than it is over here, but
Well, it is
you
in
guys seem to maybe get along a little better over there
maybe. So there's a couple
in
points.
some ways.
So yeah, for one, like, there are ultra Orthodox communities and there are extreme Muslim communities and stuff here. Those communities absolutely do exist, and in those
Mhm.
communities, you have all the exact same problems that you do in extreme religious communities in the States or anywhere else. So yeah, that is a thing. I happen to be a pretty secular guy in a very secular community. Nobody that I interact with really cares. But that being said, I have a lot of religious friends. I went to a bar mitzvah last week. We're having Passover Seder this week. I mean, like, we
Mhm.
say prayers over candles and bread and stuff. Like, yeah, I have religious friends, and people don't care. As far as that goes, I think that part of that is a difference between Judaism and Christianity, as it's currently practiced, at least. That the way my wife puts it, I particularly appreciate. She says that, look, if you're a Christian, at least in America, if you're a Christian, uh, and you don't like what the people at the church are saying, you just go to the next church down the block. But
Mhm.
if you're an American, you're Jewish, at least, especially if you're not in one of the big Jewish centers, there's only one synagogue or two, maybe, and you don't have a choice. If you want to be associated with the Jewish community, like, you're going to have to be in a community with people who have very different religious views than you. Like, that's just numbers, statistics, so that has, and that's been true of the Jewish community for a very long time, because Jews have been, at least pre-state of Israel, whatever, Jews have been in existence in exile in small minority communities throughout the world for a very long time. So this has become a part of the Jewish identity, is being very willing to tolerate people who have very different religious views than you. So it's one of the things I very much appreciate about Judaism.
Now, you said that your parents were religious and creationist, and so
True.
where is that all influenced? Did they go looking for that, or did those creationist ideas just come to the church? Does Ken Ham or Kent Hovind come to your
Yeah,
parents' church, or
honestly, I don't know, and I would love to know the answer to that question. My parents are of the variety who find that basically any questioning is offensive, so they're not a big fan of me trying to identify the answers to those kinds of questions. My mother has been extremely religious since she was a very young kid. Most young girls play with Barbie. My mother played missionary as a kid. Like, her dream was to grow up and be a missionary. She has been extremely active in her church for her entire life, and led, prayer groups and Bible studies and all that. My dad, a little bit less so, but not much. And he has gotten very much more religious in the last decade. So yeah, they're very religious. They're very conservative. They are creationists. They're all in. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know where that comes from. I don't know why it is. And trust me, I've tried to have a lot of conversations with them, and we don't have a whole lot of conversations these days. So it is what it is.
Right. Well then, so you heard it a lot. You heard it at church. Where did you hear it?
Yeah, I mean a little bit. So we had, well, I don't think that we had a whole lot of that material when we were kids. Not a ton, but some for sure. I definitely remember asking my mother something about the global flood when I was a kid, and her giving me some creationist, flood narrative book. So like this definitely was a thing in my household. My mother's sister, amazingly, is even more conservative and more religious than my mom. And they had all of it, and they had Kent Hovind videos and the whole bit. They were yeah, they're definitely all in.
Was that
Yeah, it
the
was definitely around.
was that the is it Henry Morris that did the flood book?
That's the guy. Yeah, the in the particular incident I'm talking about, my mother gave me some child's version of it, but it was definitely, it wasn't just a like, here's the Bible story. It was like this is what really happened, and this is the
Right.
flood, and it happened 4,000 years ago. Like that was definitely the context in which this book was given to me. Yeah.
And then, even though you had that upbringing, though, you aren't a creationist, and you're a scientist. And did you just outgrow it? Like, and I always tell people, I just outgrew going to church. I never really took it all very seriously. It was just something that families did on Sundays, and I always thought it was, more geared for the family and kids, more akin to Santa Claus and other holidays. It was something to do for, the family and the kids. But, when you got older, it kind of, wasn't so important, I guess. And, yeah, I just kind of, but we never had, any of the creationism. We never had any fire and brimstone, any of that. But then, I went to a Methodist church, and it was always very progressive and everything. So, I never ran into any of this stuff until I got older. I thought that, I had no idea that, there was such a large, organizations like Ken Ham and the others have. I just had, I was completely naive about it.
Yeah. So for one, your oh shoot. Yeah, the internet's blinking out a little bit, but I think I got most of that. So, yeah, I wouldn't say that I, fell out of it necessarily, because I was never particularly active. And I was to some extent. So I had a very good friend when I was young who led a prayer group that I went to, like a private group, and my family went to church every Sunday and stuff. So it was very clear when I was very young that this was the expectation. But it never really super strongly clicked with me. Like I just wasn't ever really deeply religious. Like I did it because this was the community that I grew up in, and that was what was expected. It's expected, and so you do it. But I mean, after I left high school to go to college, since I left my parents' house, I have not ever in my life, not even once, been to a church service. Like the last church service I went to was with my parents. So I was never interested in it. Like it was never a thing that I sought out. So I don't know. And I think I probably am unusual, as I know, a lot of my peers who grew up in similar circumstances ended up in the church and in the community and whatever, very active. That's fine. Different things work for different people. But I don't think I'm so unusual that I'm a single case. When I often see, and it bothers me honestly, I often see atheists disparaging the kids of creationists, or talking about how, the kids are going to be tragically ruined by their parents. And like, well, maybe. I mean, I'm not a fan of creationists telling their kids garbage either. I think science education is important, but don't discount the kids. They got a lot of years left, and some of them are going to grow up to be real smart. And yeah, don't just assume that the kids of creationists are going to turn out to be fools, because they won't necessarily. Yeah.
I have I may have pessimistic views, but I'm an optimist at heart. I always have hope.
Good.
Even yeah, I mean I talk with some folks online regularly, and it's the same thing over and over and over and over. And it's like, every once in a while I say, but I always have hope. I always have hope that you're going to realize this stuff is not true
Well,
because
maybe. I mean, but again, like it's not the the individual who's out there making the creationist arguments, they're probably not going to change, and not just not with you, but probably not ever. And as long as there are creationists around that you see, they're going to continue to exist. And a lot of them are younger than you, which means that they're going to be creationists around for your whole life. There's a saying, at least in science, that old ideas don't die; they just fade away. And that's really true. That it's not that we're going to convert all of these people who believe ridiculous scientific claims. It's that we will educate future generations, and we'll have fewer and fewer of them over the course of time. That's really what
right,
you have to work for, is not convincing the people who are already convinced that you're wrong. They're
right,
already lost. But the ones who don't know, who legitimately don't know and are curious, you have a chance with.
right. Because we were just talking the other day. We're like on the third generation of creationists because basically it's the Ken Ham generation. The
Yeah,
modern
there have been creationists
creationists
for.
are
Yeah, right. So there are
yeah.
social. Yes, I think that's probably true, and the modern creationist movement is very interesting. But I mean, there have been people around who believed in scientific nonsense forever. And that's
Oh
not
yeah,
a.
sure. It was always smaller groups though. This is like organized. It's an organized business. You know what I mean? It's taken into a whole other a whole
I
other tangent from just going. I can understand preaching things at church, but he's the ICR Discovery Institute. Well, Discovery Institute was all over the news for their phony Darwin thing that they tried to get a bunch of
sure.
scientists on. So
Yeah, I
they're
agree that they're different in scale from what came previously, but I don't think that they're different any more than the pro science communities are different. Like they're adjusting to the new technological world just like everybody else. They're getting online just like everybody else. But I'm not convinced that the size of the community is any different. I mean, I think if you went back and looked at even mainstream publications from the 60s, and you saw stuff about the House of Aquarius or whatever, like I don't know, I mean, I'm just making this up, but like I don't think the anti-science views were really any less prevalent.
oh yeah, well the '70s had plenty of stuff with.
Yeah,
It was always one thing or another, some new idea, some new everybody was doing the screaming thing, and then everybody was doing different meditations and
sure, exactly. It's
all the
not it's
retreats, and yeah, there was
right.
always some new thing, it seemed like, in the '70s.
Right. Well, and I, every generation has this, or superfoods, or whatever. Like there's no shortage of quackery is probably not always the right term, because it's not always quackery. Sometimes just we don't know enough. There's some good solid evidence behind it, and we just don't know enough information to understand that there's more evidence behind something else, or whatever. But yeah, I don't know. That's the thing. For me, the creationism really came out of my own personal, family interests and beliefs, and then flat earthism. So that for me personally, like creationism was something I could to some extent understand, partly because I grew up with it, but I don't know, partly because like the argument, well, I wasn't there to see it. Like on the face of it, it makes sense. When you learn enough physics, you realize it doesn't make any sense at all. But on the face of it, okay, well, sure, I wasn't there to see it. Well, I also wasn't there to see Abraham Lincoln, but I know he was president.
Hmm.
Um, you have to learn the physics to understand why that is. But the flat earthism, like it was fascinating to me because it is so obvious that it's wrong. Because again, I watched the moon go over the horizon. That is 100% proof positive that there's not a flat Earth. It is like, well, or okay, it's proof that the moon at least goes below. You could say it's flat and the moon goes below, but none of the flat earthers don't say this. So like it's an obvious, clear, just it is clear as day, like counting 4 apples. And yet there are still people who insist that it must be 5 apples. And I was really interested in understanding how that works mentally and what's going on inside a person's brain when they can look at something, this visual evidence, and still just come to the exact wrong conclusion. That's what I found fascinating.
Well, we're going to have an eclipse in 2 years. We're going to be able to see it right here. It was just on the news. And there's another, great example. I mean, it's round. I mean, people have seen eclipses forever. They're, nothing new. And yeah, so now I understand that people got bad information or they think they have a good argument. But, these guys go on and on with these arguments, the same ones over and over that are, repeatedly debunked. And then it gets to the point, are they just doing it for the argument's sake? They don't seem to be, getting anywhere.
Right. Well, I mean, they're doing it for the reason that we started out with, saying, the feeling of knowledge. And that's, I think, what they're seeking. They're not seeking real knowledge. They're seeking the feeling that they know something. And, to me, the demonstration of that is that this particular example of the moon going over the horizon, you can show that with, again, high school level trigonometry. It doesn't take more than maybe a couple hours. And literally, somebody who has almost no math skills whatsoever, you can walk through the proof in a couple of hours if they're patient, and show really simply, really clearly, why this has to be the case, that the moon is going lower than you. And I have tried many times with flat earthers to walk through this math. I have made up graphs and figures and stuff, and I have gotten them on private chat, and I have spent hours trying to explain just the basics. And I will tell you, I think in 4 or 5 years of intense efforts at doing something along these lines, I can only remember a single person who was willing to go through even basically the first line of the proof, and that was it. Like, they are not interested. They will happily spend 5 years, 20 hours a week watching YouTube videos and making videos of their own. They will not spend a single hour going through mathematics, because honestly, math is hard. Even high school level math is hard to somebody who didn't learn it at the time, and they're not interested in learning it. They don't actually want to know. They just want to feel smart, and that's easy. It's easy to feel smart. It's really hard to be smart.
Right. Yeah, I've had, I think, one time the discussion of the moon is receding argument. And if you take it back in time, it would have been hitting the earth. So the earth can't be more than a few thousand years old. And one time I had a guy that said, hey, he agreed to pull out a calculator with me. And we did the math, and just being very generous with numbers, not very hard at all. Easiest math you could possibly do. And we were, hundreds of thousands of years with being overly generous. And he's like, wow, I guess, and he did realize, wow, yeah, maybe I should have punched this up on a calculator. And he goes, I'm not going to use that argument anymore. So that was a small victory that he actually said, yeah, I should have probably checked that math.
Good. I had, believe it or not, a high school science teacher try that argument with me, and I responded in an email with that exact same math, showing that even by the creationist claims, that they're actually wrong. Not only are they wrong, they're wrong in the wrong direction. If you use, so this shows up in a couple different places, but sort of the one that makes the rounds the most, the guy makes a couple basic errors, and this is the amazing thing. You see the same argument go through the community. You see it over and over and over again. They all contain exactly the same couple of basic errors. Well, that none of them have gone through the actual math. They've all just copy and pasted exactly what they've seen before. So I had this high school science teacher. I did a debate with him on creationism a year ago or so. You can go look that one up. And He tried this one with me in private conversation. I showed him, I typed out the numbers in the email and said, hey, by the way, you might not want to use that argument because look, not only are you wrong, you're wrong in the wrong direction. To his credit, he didn't bring it up in the debate. To his discredit, he still stuck with his idiotic creationism and he had no qualms with continuing the argument for creationism. And even after the debate, when he responded privately and said, wow, you really walloped me in that debate and stuff, I said, yes, it's because I've studied. And here, let's talk about why you're wrong. And he still refused to accept it. He's, as far as I know, I'm confident this is true, he is still a young earth creationist, despite having been publicly shown to be incorrect, because to him it's more important that his religion is correct than that he is correct. He just, his religion is the central core of his life, and if that's wrong, then he has nothing, I guess, nothing else to live for. I don't know. I mean, to me, it's crazy, but this got to be the mentality.
Well, that's one of the arguments I've heard for people like my nemesis Ken Ham, is that he believes that it doesn't matter even if he's, maybe call it a fib or a little white lie, if it's for the benefit of the religion, then it's all okay.
Sure.
So he thinks, yeah, if I can fib to you, but you still come to Jesus, then it doesn't really matter that he's fibbing about things.
Sure. Well, and honestly, that does make sense. I mean, look, if the central tenet of Christianity, according to most Christians, is that every human being has an eternal soul that contains, your, I guess, thoughts and memories, personality, whatever. And if you die without believing this one particular thing, if you don't believe that to be true, then this soul is going to be tortured forever. Like that's the central claim of Christianity. Okay, well, if that's true and you can prevent an eternity's worth of torture for people, then yeah, that justifies an awful lot of misbehavior. I mean, that's how the Spanish Inquisition was justified. So, look, we're preventing people from going to hell, so of course we're going to put them on the rack and waterboard them, because they'll suffer a little bit here in this world, but boy, in the eternal world, they'll be really grateful that we tortured them until they accepted Christ. Like that makes sense. That's a rational position if you really truly believe this absurd claim.
That's what I can't really believe that he believes, and the other ones actually believe everything they say. I think what you said before is that the religion overrides it. One of the examples is Ben Carson, brilliant neurosurgeon, but then he starts talking about the pyramids were storage grains for Joseph to store grain in or something like that.
Yes,
and obviously a brilliant man. He was all over the news when he separated those twins that were conjoined at the head and everything. And brilliant, obviously brilliant. People say a gift, but obviously he's very well educated in what he does. But then yet he can totally be young earth creationist at the same time. So I don't see, that was back to what I was saying earlier, is that you can do good science. Doesn't matter what you believe in. It doesn't change what you're doing in the science. If it's for surgery or if you're running a nuclear test, it doesn't really matter what you believe when you're doing the surgery or the looking for a neutrino or whatever you're doing.
Yes, that is generally true. That is not always true, but it is generally true. And there are plenty of people who are scientists or who are scientists or medical practitioners or whatever, who do good work, and also have odd, unusual, unsupported, unsubstantiated views in something that's unrelated. However, there are times where it does influence people. So there are, I would argue that William Dembski is a case of this. He's a mathematician, and he, I guess he's sufficiently good at mathematics that he has an advanced degree in mathematics. That's pretty good. I'm not that great at mathematics, so he's probably better at math than I am. But I know enough math and I've seen enough of what he does. I'm pretty convinced that his religious beliefs have influenced the way that he does his work. I think that his religion is to his academic and professional detriment, unfortunately. And there are examples like that in the nuclear world too, of people attempting to argue for advanced radioactive decay to justify, younger ages for the Earth and stuff. And this is, quite frankly, nonsense for many, many, many reasons. And anybody who has a degree in nuclear engineering and who knows a bit about how radioactive decays work should know that. And unfortunately, there's a few of them out there who, I don't know, I guess make us all look bad by not knowing some of the basic tenets. So be it.
Well, that's one of the things I was going to ask you about the young Earth creationism, and that from a scientist's view, yeah, and well, you're doing decay rate research. The decay rates are just not sped up. Can you do it in the lab? Can you make these decay rates sped up to fit a 6,000 year universe?
To fit 6,000 years? No, you can't. I mean, that's not anywhere close to anything like a realistic. That's like suggesting, well, can you inject the blood of a worm into a human and make them live, or a medical, no. You can, there's some animal biological products that you can use with people, but we're so far away from the normal reality. So decay rates can be altered to a very, very small degree under special circumstances. So, for example, one kind of radioactive decay is called beta decay, where the nucleus of an atom basically converts a neutron into a proton and an electron. So you go from 0 electric charge to +1, -1, so the net stays 0. So what you see is an electron shooting out of the nucleus. Now, it turns out that you can speed up this decay rate if you, for example, really heavily ionize the atom. So if you take away all the electrons outside of the nucleus, what it does is it creates artificially this deficit of the stable configuration, at least, and that can, it seems, increase beta decay rates to a very small degree. So you can get really teeny changes, but nothing like what would create a 6,000 year span. And also, what's really the bigger problem of the public, and unfortunately, it's a technical thing, but like a lot of the sort of atheist and skeptic community, I often see make this claim, well, decay rates are constant, and there's a law of decay and stuff. Sort of, but you have to understand that the actual physicists and nuclear engineers, so those of us who work with this kind of stuff, a decay rate is not a fundamental thing. The decay rate of some isotope is not a universal constant. Universal constants are things like the speed of light or the fine alpha constant, things like these are fine structure constant. These are universal constants. Decay rates are a result of the universal constants, and they're a result using calculation through the standard model of particle physics. So we calculate what a decay rate should be based on the universal constants, and those calculations take into account things like the presence of an electric field, like you would have in an atom that would then be heavily ionized or not. And so the standard model actually accounts for this kind of a change that we do observe. Nobody says that the decay rates themselves are fundamentally constant. That's not the argument. The argument is that the constants are constant, and the model predicts that the decay rates also are constant, all except for the most extreme circumstances. And there's just no, the extreme circumstances that would have to be present to alter decay rates in a way that we see them in the real world would also alter other things in the world in a way that's detectable. So it's like if you go into your garage in the morning, you have a teenage kid or something, and you look and you see a scratch on the bumper, and you go to your teenage kid and you say, hey, there's a scratch on the bumper that wasn't there yesterday. What happened? And the teenager says, well, I was crossing the railroad tracks the other day and a big locomotive T-boned the car. And that's why there's a scratch on the bumper. Well, the evidence wouldn't really match up, because you know that if a locomotive hit the car, it would have caused a lot more damage than just the scratch. If the rest of the car is fine, that argument just doesn't hold up. And this is the kind of thing creationists are arguing. They're saying, well, look, you get these little teeny decay rate changes. And so those decay rate changes must mean that there was this giant locomotive that smashed into the whole universe and everything is completely chaotic. And that explains this little teeny scratch. Well, like, no, because there would be other evidence. The whole rest of the car would be ruined. Like, well, if these processes resulted in exponential decays in the way that creationists need them to be, the universe wouldn't exist. Like, the planet would have been destroyed. Like, it just doesn't work that way. It's not a coherent view of the world.
Yeah, one of the big pushbacks that well, I saw Erica was using it too, was the heat problem with the young Earth creationists. Yeah, shifting the continents all around during a flood, and without realizing that would have boiled all the water right off of the face of the Earth. So yeah, they, like you said, well, they try to explain something here, but they're just totally raising all these other problems in other areas that just can't possibly be, you know. Well, sure, it sounds good. Well, yeah, the continents moved, but they moved because of the flood. But it doesn't make any sense at all when you start taking into account the amount of movement that requires.
Right. Yeah. You know, there is some subset of this sort of creationist community who is willing to accept that their views don't match reality, and stick with their creationist views. And I have some respect for this group of people. If you can tell me, look, I understand that reality looks different than what I'm saying, but I have faith in my, faith in my religion tells me that this is true. Therefore, I believe it's true, even though the evidence suggests otherwise. Okay, I think it's weird. I don't think that way. I have difficulty intuiting how you can possibly view the world that way, but I accept that that works for some people. Fine. The people that really bother me are the ones who look at the evidence and then try to make up these sorts of arguments. And, oh, well, yeah, you think the evidence says that, but really it says this. You think there are 4 apples, but really there are 5, because what you don't understand is that one of them is, blah, blah, and then they come up with some just bizarre justification where any rational person can just count, no, there's 4. Like, it's 4. I'm sorry that you're wrong. You're just objectively wrong. And these kind of people, oh, well, the decays look like you think they look like it says in old Earth, but really the decay rates argue for a young Earth because they can change about. Like, no, you're just accept that it doesn't look the way that you claim, and then say my religion tells me so. Okay, I can accept the God did it crowd. I have great difficulty accepting the people who say no, the evidence supports my religion. Like, no, it doesn't. It just objectively doesn't. You're simply wrong. And to say otherwise, I think, is a form of dishonesty.
Yeah, I can accept that God did it, but like you say, when they go into the explanation of how God did it with the garden and Noah's Ark and all these kind of things, and then it's like, those are just not winning arguments for me at all. I think you should have just stopped at God did it, because the more they try to explain it, the less sense it makes. And I've told people, it doesn't matter if it's apologetics, hermeneutics, whatever you want to call it, the more they try, the less sense it makes, because it's like they're trying too hard to explain something that you just can't explain.
Yeah.
Now you can, if you go ahead.
No, they want the evidence to support them so bad. And the question is why. And I really think that the answer is because, again, they want to feel smart. People are not stupid, and they understand the cultural zeitgeist that they live in. And in the culture that we live in this technological world, frankly, physicists have a lot of clout. When I have had people buy me a beer just because of what my degrees are and what, I go chat with them at a bar. Like, people like scientists. and they like to be like scientists. And religious people aren't stupid to that. They understand that scientists have a lot of credibility, and they want their religion to have that too, because it's desirable. Unfortunately for them, they're just wrong.
Well, I will give credit to Discovery Institute, ICR, and Ken Ham's AIG. They do bring in scientists, where people like Kent Hovind just kind of keep repeating his same shtick over and over and over again. One of my, when you're talking about how many generations, Nathaniel Jeanson, that works for Ken Ham, he was homeschooled on Ken Ham's materials. And yeah, now he's full circle working for Ken Ham. So yeah, there is the generational thing where it's carrying over. And he's about as stubborn as anybody can be about it. Even though, he went to the schools and they asked him, well, what did you do when you went to Harvard and everything and that? And he said, well, I learned what they told me to learn. And he passed all the tests. So he has the mental capability. He learned it all and got good grades. I'm not knocking the guy for, his study abilities, but then he just puts it in a file in his head that's just for tests. And then any answers that he really wants, he just divides everything by 6,000 years. And hey, what do you know? The math all works out.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's true. It's unfortunate. I see a lot of this too. As I said, I grew up in this, very conservative, very religious family with creationist parents, but that does not mean uneducated. My father's a doctor, medical doctor at the family practitioner. My mother has a master's degree. There are several PhDs in their church. They are not uneducated people, which also is unfortunate stereotype that I see a lot from sort of the atheist and skeptical community, is the assumption that everybody who makes these absurd claims is some sort of uneducated yokel. Although I grew up on a farm, they're not yokels. They're smart people.
Sure.
They just are deluded. And yeah, unfortunately.
Well, I have to tell people, I said, I get accused of the same thing. Well, you're just calling me stupid. And it's like, when I'm posting memes, okay, they're jokes. You know what I mean? They're a few words to catch somebody's attention and ha ha ha, But yeah, the smart people can, believe in all kind of silly things. Smart people
Certainly.
believe, in Lucky Charms and wearing their favorite jersey for their sports team, because if they don't, the team's not going to win,
Absolutely. Well, I guess sort of part of the theme of the talk is that, people want to feel smart. And unfortunately, I think a key aspect of being smart is getting over this feeling. All of us like to feel smart. I'm no exception. I love to feel smart. I love it when people are astonished that I have a degree in physics, and it feels good for people to think you're smart. But it's really important.
Good for you, by the way. Good for you.
But like when you go through, a big part of getting that degree and going through this educational process is being told how stupid you are, or at least understanding it. I mean, look, I passed my qualifying exam a year ago. I had to give a 40-minute lecture to a room full of, PhDs who do this for a profession, and then have them grill me for 20 minutes or, longer about the topic. And I can tell you feel really dumb after doing that. Like, It sucks. It's not fun. And you have to swallow your pride and understand, I'm, like I said, at the bottom of the rung. But that's how you learn. That's a really essential part of how you learn, is just understanding that you don't know nearly as much as you think you do, and that you got to have humility and understand the boundaries of your own understanding.
And speaking of something else that especially, let's say, the groups that we're talking about like to do is speak out of their field. Now, as a physicist, you can speak on physics, and like you say, you're not the best physicist or anything like that. Being humble, but should you walk into a classroom and start teaching on another subject? Should you be, giving a platform to teach on another subject, or should you be invited to talk about physics? And if somebody asks you about something else, you should say, hey, I know physics.
Yeah, I am sympathetic to that. I think that's good advice for anybody, to be wary about talking outside of your field. And I honestly think that advice should also be turned around to the audience and understand that, people do have different degrees of expertise, and that a lot of what they say is going to be wrong. And honestly, even people who are experts in their field are going to say things that are incorrect sometimes. There's a great quote, and I honestly forget at the moment who it is, some famous physicist who retired fairly early. And there's a anecdote about a colleague asking him why he retired at some relatively young age. And his response was, when I give lectures right now, I make mistakes and I notice, and the students don't notice. And he said, 10 years from now, and I give lectures, I will still be making mistakes, but I won't notice, and the students will notice. And I think that that's really important. That you have to understand, even people who are at the top of their field will make mistakes. I make mistakes. I make physics mistakes in front of my colleagues. It's embarrassing, but it happens. That's part of being human. And anybody you talk to is going to make mistakes, just because that's how our brains work. Like, I'm sorry, we do. So when you're listening to somebody who's quote unquote an expert, you should always have a bit of doubt. I like to say, I only trust about 60% of what I say, and I trust myself more than I trust anybody else. So like, if you're trusting me more than that, you're making a mistake. Like,
Right.
you should always have a bit of doubt.
And that was the other question. The other question or accusation, I guess you could call it, is that scientists are all in cahoots with each other. They all agree with each other. They all cover for each other. If you made a mistake, it's okay. Your peer is going to fudge it for you.
Oh, definitely not.
How often does that happen?
Practically never. We don't fudge for each other. We love to point out each other's mistakes. I have a colleague who just submitted his dissertation. He asked me to edit it for him. There were red marks on every single page, all 100 something of them. And I can tell you, it's good. I have no problem with this. I am happy to tell him when he made an error, and he's happy to receive it. He asked, nobody made him send it to me to edit. He asked it as a favor, and I spent the time and I did it, and he accepted that criticism, and and gave me good feedback on my comment. Like, this is how the process works. Now we relish pointing out mistakes in each other's reasoning. I work with an older guy who he's been around for a long time. He got his PhD in the Soviet Union, but I tell you, the guy is really smart, and his whole profession's been electrical work. And the guy can redesign a circuit in his head in seconds, and it's astonishing. And every time that we work together, he'll catch some mistake or other of mine. And I tell you, those few times when I catch a mistake of his, it feels great. I love it when I can point to something that he did and say, "Oh no, I think you meant to do this." And he takes another look, and he gets really embarrassed, and it's awesome.
Sure. And like you said, that's how the system works. It's not how are you going to ever get anywhere if everybody just says, "Oh yeah, that's right," when it's wrong. And let's say the internet, they've got it all completely wrong, but everybody's just saying, "Oh yeah, it's right." Well, when you plug it in and you flip the switch, it's not going to work. It's just not going to work. So there has to be, no, this isn't right. This circuit isn't right. This program isn't right. This chip isn't right. Whatever the problem is, yeah. And then, well, of course you want to fix it, because then your idea, your project, your product, your test, your research is going to actually work out. So yeah, the idea that you wouldn't want that always seemed to bother me, because the
Yeah,
argument is it's self-defeating. Nobody would ever get anywhere if there was actually all these just patting each other on the back and saying, "Yeah, it looks good to me."
Right. Well, and it does it, the thing is that, especially, you asked me early on, what does a research institution do? And I said the research is public, and this is true of all the big schools in America as well, and most of the world. The thing is that these ideas do get out there. My dissertation probably only going to be read by maybe a dozen people or something. But if I made some extraordinary claim in there and it was wrong, I guarantee you somebody would find it and point it out. Uh, and I don't want that to happen. And so, because I don't want that to happen, when my advisor takes a look at what I do, it's really important to me that he criticizes me and points out errors. I want him to point out the errors so that when it goes to the public, it doesn't have errors in it, because it will get out there and somebody will look at it. And this is the thing, in skeptical communities, I very often ask people, well, like, which studies are you looking at? Can you show me what papers you're reading? Like, where is this been peer reviewed? Which journal published this? They do not have anything. None of them. It's the reason why creationists had to go make their own journals, because none of them could get published in reputable journals, at least on the creationist claims. And the reason they couldn't was because it's bad science. Like, it's not because the scientists were all buddy. It's because their ideas got shot down because they're demonstrably wrong. Like, yeah, science journals aren't going to publish demonstrably wrong claims because they're science journals. Like, this is what they do. So, yeah, of course you couldn't get published. So then you have to go make your own journal just so that you can claim that it was peer reviewed. Like, no, that's nonsense.
Yeah, Ken Ham has his Answers journal now, so he can be peer reviewed by himself. So
yeah, right. Yeah.
And yeah, that's his answer to peer. Well, we're peer reviewed. I peer reviewed it.
Sure, yeah.
But I don't think he knows what peer review is. And yeah, that's another. Oh, go ahead.
It's not a perfect process. Like, peer review has problems too. I mean, and there are real problems in the science world about repeatability and review like that. There are, of course, sure. It's a human process, and we're humans. We make mistakes. Okay, fine. Let's fix those problems, though. We don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Yeah, there's more good than bad. That's for sure.
Well, there's also a problem with peer review, because like some of the stuff you're doing, like you said, not everybody can repeat that in their shed in their backyard. You have to have there's only certain places, where you can do these things. And then to have it peer reviewed is, asking a lot when you guys,
yeah, that's true.
Have limited resources to begin with.
Yeah, that is true. You have to have some sense of scope and scale, though. So, like, a big part of getting a technical degree, especially an advanced technical degree, is being able to put your finger on what sort of scope you're talking about. So for one, again, we're not the only experiment that's looking for this particular kind of decay, even in this particular element. So neutronless double beta decay happens and can theoretically happen in a dozen or so elements. There are other groups who are doing it. There's maybe, I want to say something like 15 experiments in the world who are looking for this. And all those, the lead investigators on all of those 15 experiments, so this is probably couple hundred people in the world, they all read each other's papers, and all of them want to be the first because they're all vying for the same grant money. So, my advisor would like to get grants to study this particular thing. Well, so would a guy in China who's working with Panda X3, which is doing almost the exact same thing we are. So it's somebody who's working with Nexo. I think they're in Texas. They're doing almost the same thing that we are. They all want the same money. And so they all look at each other's papers so that they can go and say, oh, no, look, those guys who want the money, they made a mistake here. And those guys who want the money, they made a mistake here. My work is good, and so you should give me the money. But they're all doing the same thing. And that's peer review, yeah. So you're right. People, in their basement probably aren't looking at it. But that being said, the data analysis kind of stuff, you never know. I guess I won't go into too many details, but there are technical communities that wind up taking technical information from fields that you might not expect, just because there's some overlap. And in the commercial world, some of this gets into like copyright protections and trade secrets and stuff. And the sort of military government world, some of it's classified. So you don't see a whole lot of these kinds of discussions in the public, but behind the scenes, there are technical communities who, I'm just making this up off the cuff for this particular example, but like you might very well have people who are developing biological agents for the military who pay really close attention to food sterilization technology, and who are reading the science journal papers that are put out by General Mills. Like that kind of stuff definitely happens. So yeah, somebody might be looking at your work that you don't expect.
Sure. And another thing that gives some of the science a bad name is always the classic private companies employing scientists, where the tobacco companies were employing scientists and telling you, "Oh, smoke away," and the oil companies and everybody else, and they have their mouthpieces out there, and then they're
True.
pointed to say, "Well, see, there's a scientist that," and you could talk about the pandemic and other things too, where different people say different things. And as a scientist, if you're confused, how do you source check something?
Well, that can be a real problem. This is a big part of why who paid for the study is always, included. If it's not included, nobody's going to take you seriously. I don't remember the last time I saw any serious scientific journal that didn't say this research was funded by so and so. Now, in my particular field, the sources of funding are typically, a big science, a European Science Commission, and stuff like this, which have a sterling reputation. They're all open books, and like everybody knows what they do. You can go look up and see what the ERC, the European Research Council, ERC, does. So it's not a big deal. But yeah, I think there are different scientific communities where this is more of an issue, and some where it's less. So I can see how that could be a problem in some of the medical communities. I have no relation to the medical communities. I've never even taken a class of biology, so like I can't speak to whether or not that's true, but it makes sense that that might be an issue. So check who's funding. That's important, for sure. But I think that tends to be less of an issue within the science community or among the community of scientists than it is in public outreach. So I think that when you see public outreach funded by industry, so like the smoking, for example, they would make, back in the day, they would make advertisements that 4 out of 5 doctors, support Philip Morris cigarettes. Like that's not science. Even if they paid some scientists to do some research and that's cited at the bottom of the commercial, like that, the scientific community isn't necessarily buying into that. They did that specifically to make a commercial out of it. Well, commercial is very different than a scientific journal.
Mm-hmm. And that's another thing. Publishing in a journal and then citing it is not the same as has it been peer reviewed, because like you said, there's not only a problem with peer review, but there's so many things out there. Maybe that paper is sitting there for years and years until somebody actually comes across it and decides to take a look at it.
Sure. Well, and also, like, a lot of research can be described in different ways that are advantageous to one interest group or another. And scientists do sometimes change the wording of their research. So I heard an interview with somebody who researches hair for whatever, I don't know, that's what they happen to be interested in. They were really interested in hair and hair growth and how hair works and all this kind of stuff, because that's where their inclinations lay. But to get funding to research hair and hair growth and hair follicles and stuff, the way that they did that was that they understood that hair, and especially like hair removal, when you pull out a hair, it creates a wound. It's a small, very small wound when you remove hair from the follicle. And so they would get funding from things like the military for wound care and wound research, because they could examine under a microscope exactly what happens with your skin when you pull hair out and all this kind of stuff. And so that was a source of funding for them. So all of their research was couched in terms of wound studies, even though what they were really studying was hair. So like these kinds of things do change, like this sort of stuff happens. That doesn't necessarily mean the science is bad. And that happens on the other end too. The people who pay for it, they can take research and change the description in a way that happens to be more beneficial for them. So you have to be careful about those things. Science is not perfect. Like I said, it's a human process. It happens to be the process that we have found to be the most reliable in terms of predicting future behavior, but it's not perfectly reliable.
Yeah. Well, that's the argument I give too, that if you provide another method that is reliable, people will use it. But you just can't say, well, I don't like the way the scientific method works, but then not produce anything to counter it. Because,
Right.
well, you're not producing anything for us to pick apart either. It's easy to pick
Yeah.
apart something, yeah, if you're not producing your own models or your own predictions or your own, even your own definitions in some cases.
Right. So, in that really that you have to produce a model, I think is important. So again, this high school science teacher that I had talked about and debated last year, I pointed that out, and I asked him, and I asked him this in private conversation before as well, is that you can't just say your model is wrong. I mean, you can say that, but like that's not enough. That's not how science works. You can't, the standard model of particle physics is wrong. That's true. That is we know it's wrong. The standard model incorporates massless neutrinos, but neutrinos have a mass. We know that. We've known that for years now. We've done experiments. We can show neutrinos have mass. Standard model says they don't have mass. So the standard model is wrong. Okay, fine. Now what? Well, the standard model is still the standard. Like that's the thing. Particle physicists use the standard model. We don't use something else. Well, why don't we use something else? Because there is nothing else. Nobody
Right.
else has come up with anything better than it. And
Mm-hmm.
trust me, every particle physicist would love to come up with something better than the standard model. You'd be rich and famous. It would be amazing. You could do whatever you want for the rest of your life, study anything you like, but nobody's done it. So all these creationists come along and say, oh, well, maybe radioactive decay rates were changed and stuff. Well, for one, no, there's no evidence that that's true. And that just really doesn't even make sense. But that's not enough. Even if you think that they did change, you have to actually give a model that predicts that change.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just say maybe decay rates were different. Give me an equation. Give me literally. I want to see which variables you write down and what ranges you give for these variables, and justify those ranges and justify that equation. Until I see the mathematics, I don't care what you think is wrong with the current model. Again, a decade of debating these people, I have not had a single one of them ever present any mathematics for their view. And like I said, maybe one or two who is even willing to sit down for an hour worth of high school math. Like they just won't do it, and they don't understand just how critical that is. When standard physics is the mathematics. If you can't do the math, you don't understand the physics. And if you criticize the physics without understanding the math, your criticism is nonsense. It's completely worthless. If you
Mm-hmm.
can't do the math, I don't care what your criticism is. Shut up and give me an equation.
Right. Well, that's another thing. People, they take offense when you say something is nonsense, but it's like, well, there's a reason for the word nonsense. What you're producing, it's nonsense. I mean,
Sure. Well,
they,
yeah, and I get. I tend to be rather confrontational, or so I'm told. And people will often tell me, like, you're just calling me name. You're just saying I'm an idiot. Well, like, look, I'm perfectly capable of both calling you an idiot and also showing that to be true. Like,
right,
I can show that you're wrong and I can call you an idiot. I can do
right,
both. It's
right.
amazing. But, like, just the fact that I've called you an idiot doesn't mean I have no argument. It just means I think you're an idiot.
And that's the other thing. I think they hear me calling them an idiot, but I don't call people an idiot outright. Now, if they
Oh,
come
I do.
back and well, if they come back and say something, whatever, snarky or personal or anything, well, yeah, you might say something back, but I always try to give an opportunity. You know what I mean?
Sure.
I
Yeah.
want to give an opportunity for them. Yeah. Well, give me an argument or show me what's wrong with what, you know, Einstein predicted or whatever, go ahead. But then you just, and
Yeah.
back to being published or not. Well, I'm not going to say it because you're not going to listen. The scientists aren't going to listen anyways. And then well, it's obvious you don't really have anything then, or you would just, you'd be proud to say, well, here, you know, if you
Sure.
spent day and night in your shed and you got it all figured out, well, let's hear it. And
Right.
then as soon as you'd ask, then it's, well, no, I'm not going to tell you. You're
Right.
not going to listen anyway. Yeah. And the science won't listen to us anyways. And it's like, no, I don't see that. I think a lot of people would, like you say, give me the argument. I'd love to pick it apart, you know?
Right.
So
Yeah.
that's just, that's,
Um,
yeah.
no,
Go,
like as far as the
you would like to pick it apart. That's what you were saying, right? You would entertain it, right?
Well, in theory, I would love to pick it apart, but I've never had that opportunity because despite a
Yeah.
decade of searching for it, none of them have ever even come close to presenting anything like a mathematical description of what they argue. I mean, flat earthers are a perfect example of this. They literally cannot even draw you a picture of what it is that they believe. Uh, it's just remarkable how little information they can provide about what it is that they claim to be true. But again, like going back to the insult thing, yeah, I don't necessarily call people an idiot right off the bat. But again, my intended audience is not the people that I'm debating with. If I'm calling somebody an idiot, I don't have any expectation that that person is ever going to believe a word I say. But I've made that determination long before I called them an idiot. This is
Oh,
after
sure.
having had a discussion with them for a long time. And at that point, my conversation is entirely for the audience. And there are a lot of people who claim, oh, well, if I see somebody call somebody names, it turns me off and I'm inclined to believe the other person. I hear that kind of claim a lot, and I am not convinced that that's true. I really think that a lot of people are much more tolerant of name calling than they would like to admit. And I think that Donald Trump is a perfect example of this. An awful lot of people who supported Donald Trump, who gave their vote to give him the most powerful office in the world, an awful lot of those people would tell you privately, like, oh, I don't like people who call names. I, can't listen to somebody who calls names. Well, I got news for you. Trump's real good at calling names and never seemed to hurt him too much in the popularity among this community. So I'm not convinced that me calling somebody an idiot is going to really turn away too many people. I think that argument is something that makes them feel good in the same way that the conspiracy theories they believe makes them feel smart. It doesn't necessarily make you any better whether or not insults bother you, but it makes you feel like you're more moral if you tell someone, hey, I don't like name calling. Ooh, now I'm the good person. Like, yeah, not convinced.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and anybody can name call too. And like you say, yeah, well, let's name call. Okay. Now what's your argument?
Sure. Yeah, exactly. And
So,
honestly, like, it's people, a lot of people say, well, the internet is so harsh and you wouldn't call somebody names to their face. Like, I also don't think that's true. I call people names to their faces on occasion. Not a ton, but it happens. Like, you have to be able to take some of that. And honestly, like, people can get offended even by not name calling. People get offended by all sorts of things. My mother is offended just by asking basic questions about a religious belief. To ask the question is an offense. Well, like, how do you know? How do you know what somebody is offended by? You can be having a perfectly normal conversation and then have somebody just all of a sudden be offended. Like, it definitely happens. So I have stopped caring as much. I tend to put in less effort towards walking on eggshells and being deferential to people's offense, because honestly, it's incredibly difficult to tell ahead of time what's going to offend somebody. I have people call me an idiot every day. That happens all the time. And you know what? I don't care that much. Some people who've called me an idiot are people I still communicate with regularly, and we get along just fine. Like that, it's not necessarily a barrier.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. A couple of times, not often. I mean, usually once you get to idiot, the conversation's over. But there's been a couple times though where there's I've had some heated back and forth, and then it's like, okay, are we done now? And then we actually went on to have a conversation. So I think
Yeah,
sometimes you just got to get it out of your system. It's like, okay, yeah, go ahead and call me an idiot. Go, and then, yeah, when you see it's not bothering me, and I'm still willing to engage and talk to you, sometimes it's like, why did you do the idiot thing to begin with? If we could have just talked to begin with. But it does happen. It does happen. And there's other times too where it's the complete opposite. And I always get a hard time. But again, it's I tell people it's the way I talk. When somebody mentions something, like I was using the comparison one day, that say you never heard of an automobile. You came from a deserted island or a tropical island in the middle of the Pacific, all by yourself. You never heard of an automobile. So you came to me and you said, tell me what an automobile is. And I said, well, let's see. To start out, an automobile has four wheels. And you say, no, it doesn't. And you say, well, I'm trying to tell you, but didn't you say you didn't know about cars? Let me explain cars to you, right? And it's like, yeah, go ahead, explain cars to me. Okay, a car has four wheels. No, it doesn't. And it's like, why are you even asking me the question if you're already going to sit there and shake your head no before I've even given you the answer, And that's just
sure.
very frustrating. And yeah, it's like, what else can you say but you're an idiot and move on?
Yeah, yeah. And again, the audience at that point is not the person you're talking to. It's whoever else happens to be around.
Right. Now I can explain a car for the audience. And like you say, the lurkers are usually the audience for me too, because especially when you get around, you recognize the same people's names. You already know what they're going to say when you see them pop on. So it's
Sure.
like, oh, here it comes, and it's like, okay, thanks for wasting everybody's time. Now move along. Well, let's see. We've got about an hour and a half here. So I wanted to ask you, are there any gems that you can share with us from talking with creationists or flat earthers? Any that stand out in your mind?
Oh, I don't, man, I don't know. I've had a lot of crazy experiences. So I feel like what I, one of the things I said in this conversation here was how, they're not interested in understanding. And the experience that really made that hit home for me, I was debating with some flat earthers, and there were three of them. And this was, I think I was on a Facebook video or something. And it was one of these threads where the comments went back and forth for a long time. It was me and three flat earthers, and we kept responding for hours and hours and hours. And fairly early on, so I wasn't quite sure where they were coming from, but fairly early on, I asked, what happens? So if I hold a brick out at arm's length and I let go of it, what happens? And this wasn't a gotcha question. I wasn't trying to do any. My goal was to try to walk them through some sort of very basic concepts in physics, and this was just an entryway. So okay, so we could talk about this. Well, the brick falls, of course. If you hold out a brick and you let go, it falls to the ground. Okay, well, let's talk about why that is. What do we mean when we say a brick falls to the ground? This was the idea. But I talked to these three people for days, and I could not get them to answer that question. What happens when you hold out a brick and you let go of it? They would not. They refused to answer the question. They would not say it falls. They wouldn't say it. And I no matter how many times I said, I rephrased it. I told them, look, I'm not trying to. This is not a gotcha. I just want to know what happens. They simply would not answer the question, and that's really what drove home to me that they're not interested in the conversation. They're not interested in learning. They're just doing it for the psychological benefit of feeling better. Like they had zero interest in learning anything about physics. That was not anywhere close. That was a big experience, or big standout thing in my head. Another one for getting the mentality was, there was a meme that somebody put out with relation to the flat Earth groups, where it was a globe and it had all of the oceans were on, like in the south. This is a very like cartoonish globe, and the bottom was all blue, and then the top was like the globe with the ocean part being brown, suggesting that the water had gone down. And they said, this is how flat earthers think gravity works. And that was a big click in my head about, like, that's right. That's exactly right. Flat earthers think that there is this downward stuff. That's what we experience, the thing that happens when you let go of a brick. And then there's also gravity. And these are two totally separate things. The downward stuff and gravity are separate in their head. And they can't get it into their head that gravity is the downward stuff. Like, that's what we mean when we say gravity. It's the thing that makes stuff go down. And so that was also a big sort of revelation. So yeah, every once in a while, when you're engaged in this kind of thing a lot, you have one of those sort of epiphanies. Those were a couple of them.
I think Professor Dave was having a similar thing when he was explaining. That's why everything is round. Gravity. That's why the stars and the planets and the rocks and the moons, maybe, a little cattywampus, but basically they're round. And it's basically end of argument. The earth is not the exception to the rule, of all the heavenly bodies. They're all round.
Yeah, and I think when you get to that point, you're well sort of beyond where most flat earthers have any sort of understanding. But so a similar experience, though not directly related to this. I have a cousin who we were having very good discussion about science and stuff, and she's great. She's fabulous. She's not anti-science or anything like that. She's just curious, and she doesn't really know. She's not in the community. And we had this great discussion about nuclear engineering and atoms and atomic physics and what an atom is and all this kind of stuff. And we talked for probably 30 minutes, and she was just asking questions, and it was great conversation. And at the end of this 30 minutes or something, she said, well, thank you for all of this. This was fascinating. Now I want to go see an atom. Can I dig one up in my backyard? Because to her, the conversation where I was talking about atoms and stuff, this was like some exotic thing, something you find, you have to go to a laboratory to see an atom, and no matter how many times I said, all of it's atoms. You are made of atoms. Your hand is atoms. The air you're breathing is atoms. The computer is atoms. It's all of it atoms. I told her this several times. It didn't click in her head that this stuff, this is atoms. Atoms was this other thing. And I think that really is a fundamentally human error that I see in a lot of these communities, that there is, the flat earthers would say there's the equations and the theory, and then there's reality. And no, the equations and the theories and reality are the same thing, or at least the equations describe the reality. They're not describing something else out there. They're describing the reality. And that's why those who have a different view of reality, be it a young earth or a flat earth or whatever, that's why you have to come up with equations, because the equations are the reality. Show me which equation you used to predict that the earth is 6,000 years old. I want to see which equation, because I've seen a lot of equations and I've seen a lot of evidence, and my equations and my evidence don't fit that. So, where's the math error? If you don't have any math at all, I'm not going to be convinced that you're correct.
Yeah, and that's another argument that you hear a lot, that people just don't want to know. And it's like, no, we want to know. Science wants to know. I want to know. I have a million news feeds I follow. They're almost all science related. And it's like, yeah, it's fascinating. A lot of people like science and would want to know. Let us know. But like you say, all you hear is crickets. And, well, I don't like your science. I don't like this science, attacking Richard Dawkins or some of the ones they don't like. And it's like, well, that's fine that you don't like him, but what don't you like about the science he did? I cannot like him too. There's Richard Dawkins has said things that were off color about certain things, and it put people off. But if he's teaching something, did he teach it right or did he teach it wrong? It doesn't matter what his personality is.
Sure.
And of course, the flat earthers are a bit much for me. And, I always kind of limited myself with the creationists because I figured, well, I picked my fight with the creationists. So my view is always, go ahead.
Sure. No, to me, the claims of the creationists are really not any less wacky than the claims of the flat earthers. They really aren't. That creationism is exactly as well supported as flat earthism, and I get a lot of pushback when I say that, but I have spent a ton of time in both of those communities, and I've spent a lot of time doing physics, and that really is true. That creationism and flat earthism, they are equally well supported, and I really see no reason why you would believe one or the other, or believe one and reject the other, whatever. And it is bizarre and amazing to me when I see creationists, chuckle at flat earthers. Like, why on earth are you mocking these people? Their claims are exactly as well supported as yours. Like, you are doing the exact same thing. So yeah.
Yeah, Danny Faulkner, Ken Ham's astronomer, did a video mocking the flat earthers, and I think it was Georgia that did it with him. And they were sitting there chuckling and laughing, and isn't this ridiculous? And they make this stuff up,
right.
And it's yeah,
of course. And I'll sit there and chuckle with them, and then turn it right around and chuckle and laugh at the creationists because their claims are exactly as ridiculous. And then they get ticked off. Well, how can you call me an idiot? And then they'll go call a flat earther an idiot. Well, look, if you're willing to call a flat earther an idiot, then you got no room at all to complain about somebody calling you an idiot. If that is acceptable towards flat earthers, then it's acceptable to you. And I get this, on even less controversial things. My parents, extremely conservative, extremely religious. I absolutely have heard them talk down about people of other religions. I have heard their pastor mocking even other kinds of Christians, Seventh-day Adventists or whoever. I have heard their pastor make jokes about people of other religions, and then the whole congregation laughs. I have heard that. And if that's acceptable for other religions, then boy, it's acceptable for you. I get to laugh at your religion too. There's no double standard here. Either we get to laugh at all of them or none of them. And I'm pro laughter. I am all for laughing at the ridiculousness. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's all fair with the creationists because they just got done calling scientists all kind of names, calling them liars and conspiracy, and they're just in it for this and that, and they've just completely badmouthed them. And then, hey, when I say something back, you're like, oh, you can't say anything to me. And it's like, well, you started it.
Right.
You're going to call people liars, and then I'm going to say, hey, what are they lying about? Right. And then you get bent out of shape just because I asked, And like I say, I try not to attack. When I was younger, I was a little more of a jerk, but I try to give benefit of the doubt, even when it's somebody's name I recognize. I try to put the question out there first. And it's
I get the same with the anti-vaxxers the anti-vaxxers will claim, big pharma is doing it all for profit and all this and rail against the scientists. Well, okay, you're telling me that these people who invested a decade of their life going to school and medical school and did that with most, and I know a lot of people in the medical community, most of them do it because they sincerely believe they're helping out humanity and they're curing disease and working for the betterment of mankind and stuff. You're telling me that all these people are dishonest, they're lying about their work, they're greedy and just going for the money, and like you're making all of these horrible claims about people in the medical community. Well, then what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Then man, I feel no problem at all talking about you being, a stupid, uneducated idiot. Because if you're going to call them greedy, lying, whatever, then tough luck. You've given up all of your credibility there. If you're going
Right.
to impugn the motivations of the medical community, then you don't deserve the benefit of the doubt. Like, too bad.
Yeah, it's the Christian go-to is always, a fool saith in his heart there is no God. And it's like, well, if you can call me a fool, I can call you a fool back. I mean, it's
Absolutely.
well, you can't call me a fool. You called me one. So
Sure.
yeah,
Right.
if you're not going to be able to at least be fair, and like I say, I try to be fair. Like I said,
Yeah.
even if somebody starts off calling me names or something, I still try, because it doesn't bother me. So I still try to look past it and say, look, do you have an argument? I still try, do you have anything to say? So I always think that I go above and beyond what I don't get in kind usually.
Yeah, for me, it's very much a case by case kind of basis. It really depends on the context. There are certain individuals who I'm comfortable start insulting after 2 interactions in 5 sentences. There are sometimes that happens sometimes, and I'm okay with that. Usually, when that happens, it's because because of what I've seen from them. And, I'll typically go check out somebody's page or see what other kind of posts they have. But as we were talking before the show started, like, a very important skill in these kinds of debates is to be able to size people up very quickly. And if you've been doing this for as long as I've been doing it, you learn pretty quickly how to assess what kinds of discussion are going to work for some people and not for others. And there are some people for whom there really is no recourse, but you can use them. So for example, maybe a month or two ago, was in a conversation. I had half a dozen exchanges with somebody that was going reasonably well, and then some other person jumped into the conversation, and within 3 comments, it was really clear to me that there was absolutely no movement going to happen with this new person. It was just not going to happen. And I thought that insulting, pointing out some major flaws in their claims, and then hitting them back pretty hard would be effective at encouraging the conversation that I'd originally been in. And I think I was correct, because then I continued the further conversation for like 2 days with the guy. And at later points in that conversation, I could point back and say, well, I thought you were better than this friend of yours who jumped in, and I had to insult because he was such a fool. I thought you were better than that. And then he would change his ways and he would come back and, oh, I'm sorry, you're right. And we'd continue on. So sometimes there are useful fools. I guess that's the Russian thing.
Well, speaking of useful fools, one last thing I wanted to bring up before we wrap it up today.
Yeah.
What do you think about philosophers?
It depends a lot on the philosopher. There's a couple philosophers that I have a lot of respect for. I have a lot of respect for sort of the broad and grand tradition of philosophy. I do not have a tremendous amount of respect for the current state of academic philosophy. Not that I stay particularly up to date on it. I don't really read a whole lot of philosophy journals. Every once in a while, I'll glance an article here or there. But I think there's an awful lot of nonsense that gets around in the communities that's given a lot more credulity than it should. Credibility, I guess. I don't know. It, like, in physics, if somebody comes out with an idea that is frankly just stupid, people aren't afraid to say it. They'll say, no, that's dumb, or it's wrong, like that's wrong. We point that out very quickly. I don't see that kind of thing in philosophy. In philosophy, there are philosophers who will publish papers with ideas that, quite frankly, are just dumb, and the philosophy community will spend an awfully long time debating the merits of what is pretty much on the face of it a dumb argument. And I think that's to the discredit of the community. I think that is I think that comes across to the broader public. I think there's a reason why people don't have a whole lot of respect for the philosophy community anymore. There was a time, maybe 100, 200 years ago, where philosophers got a lot of respect as being, very intellectual academics. they don't so much anymore. And I think there's a reason for that.
I tell people philosophy had a place when people had a lot of questions and no way to get answers for them. But today we go looking for answers, and a lot of, like you say, the endless day after day pondering something to what end doesn't seem to make any sense when you could put it to the test, you know?
Yeah.
Let's put it to the test, you know? If you think, well, whatever it is, whatever you're philosophizing about, it seems,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well,
that it can go endless, 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 rather than, hey, why don't we just ask a physicist or a chemist or somebody, to make up a test?
yeah. And I can tell you, I don't interact a whole lot with a lot of professional philosophers, although a couple I've had some interactions with here and there. Um, but I've had an awful lot of amateur philosophers and some who ought to know better tell me that my degrees in physics and nuclear engineering are irrelevant to a conversation on philosophy. Well, I'll tell you, if a degree in physics is irrelevant to your philosophy, then your philosophy is dumb. I'm not demanding that you have to be a physicist, but if you're
Right.
telling me that physics is completely separated from your philosophy, what you're telling me is that your views do not comport to observable reality. Well, like, what are
Hmm.
you doing philosophy for then? Like, I mean, this is just, yeah, it's absurd. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree. Yeah, a lot of not a lot that we disagreed on, but I really like talking with you about all the things,
Well, I
and
appreciate it.
I appreciate your views as a scientist and being honest, and that hopefully some people will listen that have said certain things that I brought up. That, look, scientists are not the bad guys. They're not trying to cover for each other. Uh, Most scientists are out to do things because they want to do them. They want to discover a cure. They want to become a teacher. They want to dig up dinosaur bones, and the the conspiracy theories behind it all, I understand, are rooted from those that give the science a bad name. Again, the ones that worked for big tobacco and everything and stuff. But the idea that, science is all bad, when my biggest argument is, if science is all bad, why give us the internet? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You would think that that would be the last thing you would want to do, is for you and I to be talking around the world and actually be able to question these things. Seems
Sure.
totally not the way to do it. They
Yeah.
should hide all the textbooks. There should be no internet. Yeah, if you want to learn something, it should be in dark rooms in back corners where they have the books in vaults, and only the priest on a certain day of the year is allowed to open them and read them. But like you said, you have public universities where you can look up what they're doing.
Yep.
It's not a big mystery. And if you want to know, spend a few minutes online. Journals are online now. Some may be paywalls, but a lot of the stuff is all online, and people just making it out to be a big mystery or a conspiracy when you have the internet. And I tell people, I love the internet. When I was a kid, there was no internet. When I get accused of, oh, you just heard a YouTube video or any of those things, it's like, no, no, no. We had to go to the library. We didn't have the internet. You have it now. Look the papers up. Look the texts up. Source. Where these people are getting these things from. And I always tell everybody, scroll all the way down to the bottom. If they're only sources themselves, it's probably a bad source. When you
Yeah.
have, a whole page of sources listed at the bottom, you got a good idea that it's a better source. And there it is, a couple keystrokes away, or voice activated on your smartphone, or if you have a microphone on your computer, just ask, and it will tell you. If I've got an Alexa in my living room, you can just ask it. Stop, resisting. It's okay to know these things. And for the religious people, It's okay to learn science and everything and stuff and still have your faith. There are people, like you said, that do science, that do physics, that do, they're involved in all kind of fields that have different views, different religions, young earth creationists doing physics, that everybody can do science. And the idea that you can't do science because of your view or anything and stuff, like you said, do the science, produce something, let us see it. And that's what anybody can technically do, even if it's, from your shed and it's not about CERN or something. But yeah, present it, and it's not a big conspiracy. And hey, Adam himself says he'd be happy to look at it. Just produce it and he'll pick it apart.
What's the math? You got to have the math, though. It's got to be real math.
Right. All right, well, let's wrap it up then. It's been a couple hours, and it's probably getting later over there for you. I'm sure you got things to do.
Past my bedtime.
Be safe over there, and maybe we can have a talk another day.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Hey, thanks a lot for being here, Adam.
Have a good one.
You too.
Bye.